Professor Jin, thank you so much for taking your time with us.
You're very welcome.
China has set its GDP growth rate at over 6% this year. What do you make of the target? Will it be easy for China to achieve that goal?
I think it's a reasonable and moderate goal. We at Peking University have estimated that the Chinese GDP growth rate can potentially go as high as 8%, but the central government has set the policy growth rate at over 6%. I think this is because we want to make sure that we confident and comfortable dealing with any unforeseen situation going forward. So personally, I think there's a very good chance that we can achieve that target.
Premier Li has also called for deepening reform of China's financial system while delivering the government work report on Friday. Which fields do you think China's financial reform will focus on in the next 5 years?
Well, over the last few years, I think the central government has stressed the importance for the financial sector to really serve the real economy. And that is because over the course of the last few years, we have seen a lot of financial activities mainly aiming at achieving a higher return at the cost of sufficient support of the innovative private sector of the Chinese economy. And as a result, a large amount of financial capital has flowed into, for example, the real estate sector and certain public equity markets, causing concerns about financial bubbles, which could cause financial instability going forward. So this time, the Chinese government has set a very clear objective that we are going to do everything to prevent and diffuse systemic risk in the financial sector. Last year, as the Chinese economy was struggling to recover from COVID and from the global trade supply chain reorganization, the Chinese Monetary Authority also has injected a large amount of liquidity into the economy. This again revived the concerns about high leverage and the sustainability of the financial situation in China, particularly in the private sector. So I think going forward, the first and most important objective for the Chinese financial sector is to stabilize. Now, a second priority for the financial sector reform, I think, should be focused on assisting the Chinese innovative sector to achieve substantial growth so as to lift the quality of the Chinese economic growth. We have stressed the importance of a high quality development in China and a so-called innovation-driven economy. In the past, China has been relatively stronger in the development stage, but weaker in the research, especially in some of the basic research scientific discovery process and those so-called core technologies that are essential for its high quality growth. So now the government has stressed the importance of allocating more resources and putting more emphasis on achieving a more substantial growth in its core technology and intellectual capitals. So we need to see more financial resources being allocated into those basic research and into the development of core technologies so that China can be assured that its economic growth going forward would not be constrained and disrupted by the lack of those core technologies. The third is to achieve environmentally sustainable growth. Mr. Xi Jinping has announced that China aims to achieve a peak carbon emission by the year 2030. In another 30 years, to achieve carbon neutralization. These are both very, very ambitious objectives. I think the whole society is now trying to estimate how much it's going to cost China. But these are also very important milestones for the development of a quality economy in China. So I think China has to do everything in its capacity to achieve it. The financial sector has to play a very important role, again, in allocating sufficient resources and in streamlining all the incentives for the whole society to work together.
In the course of deepening reform and opening up, we've seen many financial reform projects were launched and the pilot zones were set up, including pilot tests in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangdong for digital currency and offshore RMB transactions, etc. What role do you think these pilot programs played in China's financial reform?
Well, these are, as you said, pilots. They are experimentations before large-scale policies can be rolled out. The Chinese reform and opening up policy has always had a bit of a gradualism. We don't like those so-called shock therapies. We don't want to see big disasters because policies has not been battle tested. We would like to use these pilot, or sometimes we call them special economic zones, to be set up so that we could do a little bit of experimentation, so-called trial and error. We could then make sure that those policies would be as clean, as foolproof as possible. I think the fact that China is willing to set up so many experimentations, so many pilot projects, is an indication that the Chinese reform would be going forward and the opening up policy would not change. And I'm confident that a lot of these experiments would speed up as the Chinese economy gets back on its feet.
Then, speaking of digital currency, how will financial services change with the rollout of digital yuan in China?
Well, this particular experimentation, I don't personally think we're going to see a lot of dramatic changes. I think we should probably not have too high an expectation on what can be achieved just by the digital yuan as it is currently set up. It's just a digitalization of our current banknotes. It's backed by sovereign credit of the Chinese central bank, and that's it. Other than that, it's just a test of a instrument of a payment similar to what we have already seen, for example, used by WeChat. We probably would not likely see a large jump in the technology, in the speed to achieve a very advanced stage of the digital currency or the overall digitalization of Chinese financial system. But over the course of a few years, now if you look back, you would likely see a substantial change to the financial sector.
As you mentioned earlier, we're expecting greatest quantity of foreign capital inflows in the years to come with the deepening of China's financial reform and the opening of a financial market. Then what challenges does it pose to the Chinese government and the Chinese companies, especially the mid and small-sized ones?
I think that's an important question for China. We've indeed saw increase of international capital inflow. That's probably not surprising given that the Chinese economy is among the very few of the major economies that have already started recovering. So it's one of the very few bright spots. A large amount of capital has already started flowing into China. To some extent, I think the Chinese government has embraced those capital inflows. And this is an indication of China's confidence in opening up and also in making sure that China is a responsible global citizen, allowing capital free flow to a certain extent. To the small and medium-sized enterprises, this can actually be a blessing to some extent because they find that financing has become easier in the past year. But the situation is not likely to be very sustainable going forward, as China has largely recovered from the economic crisis. It's going to go into a more normalization period, and we will likely see those oversupply of liquidity, so to speak, to gradually subside. It's not likely we're going to see an abrupt change of the policy because, as the Premier has said in the government's work report, we will not want to see a turnaround of the financial policy because that's going to cause a huge shock to the economy. But gradually, we will probably see the slow dry up of the oversupply of liquidity. In fact, in the report, the Premier said that we will likely see the money supply growth to be in pace with the economic growth going forward, which, as we mentioned before, was anywhere between 6 to 8% per year. So the money supply growth is likely going to go down. And this could cause difficulties to the small and medium-sized enterprises, especially the private sector businesses in China, if they are not expecting it coming. So I would say that the quick flowing in and likely drying up of liquidity would cause a bit of financial instability in China, and those small and medium-sized enterprises are those that's going to be hit the hardest. They have to take precautionary measures for those.